Welcome to our monthly International Development and Innovation Seminar Series at the Open University. I am Dinar Kale and I'm a Professor of Innovation and Development here at the OU. And we are delighted to have an amazing seminar and a speaker with us today. Dr. Ariadne Collins, from lecturer at the School of International Relations at University of St. Andrews. Um, Ariane will be presenting on Forest of Refuge, Decolonizing Environmental Governance in the Amazonian Guiana Shield. Her book with the same titles has come out this year, so you should look at the link on her page. Ariane has also been a great friend of DPP and has been a significant contributor to our module streams, and we really thank her for that contribution. And before I hand over to Ariane, there are some rules. The video is being recorded and will be available for playback after, so people who don't want to be featured can ask questions in Q&A. Ask remain anonymous. You are automatically muted, but please raise your hands if you want to ask a question. And there is a Twitter link, international development underscore OU. Please follow that. We will have 45 to 50 minutes of presentation, and then there will be time for Q&A. I hope you will stay all the time, all through it. Again, welcome everyone, and over to you, Ariane. All the best. We look forward
Uh,
to it.
Thank you very much for having me, Dina. And hello, everyone. I will, of course, try to make my presentation work as the first step. Bear with me. Share screen. There. Okay, that appears to have gone more smoothly than I anticipated. So let's hope it continues in that way. Could someone just confirm that they can see the slides and hear me clearly?
Yes, we
Okay,
can. I can see the slide and hear you well as well. Yeah, but,
okay,
yeah.
good. Thanks. So as has already been mentioned, uh, sorry, yes, the presentation focuses on my book, which is currently pictured on your screen. It's entitled Forest of Refuge, Decolonizing Environmental Governance in the Amazonian Guiana Shield. It's the culmination of roughly 10 years of work of thinking about avoided deforestation policies in the region and the different factors that resist its implementation. But generally, I'd say that the question on the screen is what animates my work. I wondered, after having done quite a bit of research on avoided deforestation policies, I wondered what decolonial environmental governance could look like in an almost thoroughly colonized part of the world. As I go through the presentation, you'll be better able to contextualize this question. But earlier work that I had engaged in had effectively argued that part of what was resisting the effective implementation of the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation initiative, which I'll come back to also, what was resisting its effective implementation in Guyana and Suriname, the two case studies that I look at, was in part, at least, the colonial histories of these countries. And I had felt like these colonial histories had gone overlooked in especially in the way in which they condition and inform forest use practices on the ground. But I'll show you how I came to this idea. But first, let me show you a few snapshots from my field work, which is now, these images are now 10 years old. But the image on your screen at the moment was taken in Suriname. So Suriname is formerly Dutch Guyana, and so it was colonized by the Dutch. And the image that you're seeing is of the reservoir of the Athabasca hydropower dam. I'm standing on one side of the dam, and if you look across on the other side of the river of the image, you might be able, if you have really good eyes, to see a few gaps in the forest cover. Those gaps are the result of deforesting activities related to gold mining and so on. So this dam was constructed while Suriname was still colonized by the Dutch. And the dam was constructed to provide low cost energy to the to the bauxite manufacturing uh, endeavors that were taking place in the area. Some Maroon communities who had lived in this area, in the land that is now submerged, so now under the water that you're seeing, these Maroon communities had been forcibly relocated to areas nearby. So even though this image looks somewhat harmless and innocuous, maybe even a bit pretty, what I see when I look at it is an intersection, the overlap of oppressive colonial histories, submerged lands that Maroon communities had claimed, and an ongoing negotiation between economic activity that is driving deforestation and colonial histories that continue to shape these environments. In the next picture, the picture that you're perhaps seeing now, I'm standing in an area called Browns Bear. This is actually a mountain, bear meaning mountain, that is close to Browns Bear. So the community, the set of Maroon communities that I mentioned that were relocated, forcibly relocated by the Dutch colonial government, they were relocated to this area called Browns Bear. And Browns Bear is nearby that set of communities. So what's happening here is that Browns Bear was eventually designated as a conservation area. So a lot of tourists go there to try to experience nature. They can stay there, take pictures. You hear the animals in the morning. It's really rich in wildlife, or at least it was at that time. However, gold mining was taking place within Browns Bear. And this was something that a number of conservationists that I had spoken with in the region had found quite concerning. When I spoke to the government officials that were responsible for determining whether or not gold mining could take place in this area, I was told that the reason that the mining was allowed in a conservation area actually because it was being carried out by these Maroon communities who were forcibly relocated when the dam was constructed. But just to focus on the picture once a bit more, if you look in the distance, you could perhaps see a bit of like white hue at the top of the water. This is actually dead trees. So when the Appomattox Dam was constructed, the Dutch colonial government did not see it fit to remove the trees from the area that was to be submerged. So the trees were just left standing there, and they are still physically present in some ways, and they're almost, I mean, without being dramatic, they're almost like skeletal fingers emerging a bit from the water. So this is another image that I see as highlighting or featuring the overlap between colonial histories, conservation, and demands for development, largely coming from the communities nearby. So the man pictured on your screen. So now I'm moving a little further, going closer to the Maroon communities themselves. And this man is the man with whose story I start the book, actually. He is the leader of a Maroon community, and he is also a gold miner. So I visited these communities and I asked him how he felt about the need to try to conserve nature and to protect forests, to try to protect the environment and mitigate the effects of climate change. And he said that he thought it was really important for the forest to be protected. I asked him um, whose responsibility this is. He said he thinks it's the government. But then I asked, I like was curious. I said, but you're also a gold miner. So how do you square this desire, your own expressed desire for development and your need to cut forests down, self-described need to cut the forest down to mine for gold? He said he knows he's a gold miner who engages in deforesting activities. He'd rather not, but this is what he has to do to survive. The gentleman pictured on the screen here is showing me the house that the Dutch colonial government had given him and his family members to live in. So this man was a child when the relocation took place. So is indicating in the image. In that moment, he's telling me that the house was too small, it was too hot, it was ill-suited for a family of four. And instead, what the community members are doing, or at least felt forced to do, is to use the resources, often in ways that we might deem exploitative, to construct domiciles that look more like the one that's adjacent to that house. So the one in orange is the one that they were able to build on their own, and the one in brown, the wooden one, is the one that was constructed for them by the Dutch colonial government. Just to digress a little bit, after having conducted this research and so on, coincidentally, I was invited to talk about decolonizing knowledge at a university in the Netherlands last year. And this group of people, they were going to film on submerged histories as part of their set of events, the students were. And I went along and came across a film that really beautifully puts together all these histories. Apparently, it was oriented around one of the children of this, one of the children of one of the families that were forcibly relocated to build the Aqueduct Dam. And I learned from that film, so subsequently, that the communities found these houses wholly unsuitable, largely because they were not um, they were not laid out in circles. They were also not constructed from suitable material that made the houses cool enough. So, in order to try to sustain themselves and to bring about an improved standard of living, however defined, they started to exploit the natural environment in harmful ways. Some of the effects of this exploitation can be seen in the image on your screen now. Just to give you, this is a medium scale gold mine that's right near where, very near Brownsack. So there's one main road that comes from the capital city of Paramaribo and goes through the forests. As you go deeper into the forests, past the dam, past Brownsbeck, and so on, you get to more remote areas of Suriname where maroon communities are less affected by the development trust. But generally, along that road, you can see this example of a mine, or could see it in 2014. And I think this image gives you a good example of what we're dealing with, because you can see the tree in the background, two men working in the mine, the size of the machinery. Not all of these mines are owned and operated by maroon communities, but largely maroon communities are, and so Afro descendants in Suriname are, they are largely responsible for mining. So when you talk about avoiding deforestation in the region, these policies are confronted by these histories on the ground. Just two more images. One of them, so this is now further down the Suriname River, the one that was the one off which the reservoir was constructed. I'm sitting on the boat here, and this man is trying to take me further down the river so I could talk to some other maroon communities. But it's difficult to navigate, largely because the water levels are too low. So that's on account of a number of things, but also on account of the dam. So the communities are less able to move as freely through the waterways as they used to be able to, because of the dam's construction. So the man is using the stick to try to avoid the rocks. And a little further afield in the west of Suriname, getting closer to the Guyana border, I spoke to this woman who told me about a different set of drivers of deforestation. She told me about deforesting activities that were being undertaken on account of the need for extracting lumber, or the desire for extracting lumber, usually for export. So there were large corporations operating in the area, and the indigenous communities there felt like their needs and desires were not being heard, they were not being listened to. And she tells me about how difficult climate change is making their lives. So, for instance, if you look on the right side of the image, you might notice that you see this little plant. She's telling me that it used to be much bigger, but now the plants are getting smaller and smaller. So it's harder for them to sustain themselves. She tells me of the fact that they can no longer farm for the long periods of time that they usually, during which they usually farm. So, for example, when they might have been able to stay out until 11 in the morning and then take a break for lunch and come back at 1, they have to stop doing work outside at 10 and come back at 2 because it's just too hot. So these are the different ways in which some of these communities are navigating and grappling with climate change, the demands for conservation, and just the political situation that positions them in particular ways in relation to the forest and the histories that position them in these ways. So in order to situate these insights and these snapshots, it's important for me to tell you a little bit about colonialism in the Amazonian Guiana Shield. So both in the image on your screen, you can see a map of both countries. So if you look at the image on the right, what you can see more clearly the Guiana Shield. Most of the shield is actually claimed by Brazil, but Guyana and Suriname are the only two independent countries that are entirely a part of the shield. French Guyana is also entirely within the shield, as you might see, but it's still an overseas department of France. So effectively still a colony. So Guyana gained its independence from the British, Suriname from the Dutch, and this doesn't mean that Guyana was always British or that Suriname was always Dutch. As events changed within Europe over time, over the centuries of colonization, there were different claims on the forest. So Guyana was at once a Dutch colony, Suriname also once British, and so on and so forth. Effectively, though, it's important for me to highlight that the populations of these countries are very small. Guyana has a population of 750,000 people, and Suriname 500,000 people. But the majority of these populations resides on the coast. So this is where most of the major cities are, and the coast of Guyana, at least, are below sea level, so highly vulnerable to climate change and flooding. The coasts of Suriname are not that vulnerable, but the country is still quite susceptible to flooding, especially the coastlines. So in both countries also, even though the coastlines are quite built up, somewhat industrialized, as you might imagine, the forested areas are sparsely populated, and that sparse population is indigenous or maroon. Maroon communities, I've mentioned them several times so far, but just to highlight for those of you who might not be familiar, Maroon communities had their origins in transatlantic slavery. So they were basically the people who were brought to these countries to labor on the plantations brought by Europeans. And Maroons were able to escape the plantations and to rely on the traditional knowledge systems that they had brought with them when they were relocated to these lands. They were able to rely on those knowledge systems to survive in the forests. In the case of Suriname, Maroon communities, they met with indigenous people and they had a somewhat I wouldn't say harmonious, but a more amicable relationship where different parts of the land were just allocated and people were able to set up residence in the forest. The Maroon communities in Suriname continued even after they became more established within the forest. They continued to attack the plantations until eventually a peace agreement was signed between the Dutch colonial government and these communities that that committed the colonizer to prevent future settlers from bothering these community members. So peace agreements were signed with the Maroon communities in the 17th century and with indigenous communities in the 18th century. These agreements were not at all recognized when Suriname gained independence from the Dutch. So the now independent government, as of 1975, claims all the land its own. So any type of indigenous or maroon land claim has now been more or less nullified or made subject to the claim of the independent government. In the case of Guyana, that did not take place because indigenous communities had been working with the European colonizers at the time to stop communities from fleeing into the forests. So when I say communities, sorry, I need to be more specific. Indigenous communities in Guyana were working with the colonizers to stop enslaved Africans from escaping into the forests, which basically means that there was not as strong a presence of maroon communities in Guyana. There are some claims that they existed, but you don't see the organizational presence, as is the case in Suriname. So to continue along, so these two countries, although they are geographically a part of South America, they are politically and historically Caribbean. They have, and the Caribbean region on the whole has experienced over 400 years of colonialism. They started, like, plantations in the region started to develop from the 16th century onwards, where I think maybe I should start a little further back, bear with me. Basically, we need to think that indigenous populations were present in these lands before the European encounter. When Europeans found the lands that eventually became Guyana and Suriname, they decided that they would like to set up plantations along the coasts. In order to provide labor for these plantations, at first the Europeans turned towards indentured servants from Europe, and when events in Europe um, played out in such a way that people were less willing to move to the region to labor on the plantations, the colonizers turned to more populous Africa to try to get labor for the plantations. That move saw millions of people forcibly relocated to Guyana and Suriname to work on plantations along the coast. So a multi-ethnic society began to develop through which we could see different groups of people relating to nature in particular ways. Then, when the enslaved Africans were emancipated, the Europeans turned towards Asia to try to get more indentured servants to come to the region. So, in the case of Guyana, there are a number of people from India and China, and in the case of Suriname, the same, plus also from Java, because at the time, Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch. So, suffice to say that the different groups of people who populate these countries have very specific arrival dates and very specific economically conditioned ways of relating to nature. So going back to deforestation, you can see on your screen another example of the outcome of deforestation in the region. So what the effects look like on the land. But it's important for me to highlight too that the main drivers of deforestation in this region are gold mining, so largely small scale, relatively difficult to control small variants of small scale gold mining. Large scale gold mining is less of a driver of deforestation because it stays in one place, more or less. Unsustainable forestry practices is those are another source of deforestation, and then infrastructure, largely through infrastructural development, largely through foreign investment. I'm sorry, for some reason, it's like my brain is running ahead of my ability to speak, but I'll continue. So the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Initiative is an international environmental policy that sought to avoid to pay countries that had significant amounts of forest cover not to cut their forests down. So I was initially curious about the extent to which REDD Plus could work in this environment. Effectively, in the book, I argue that a climate change and development paradox had emerged, where and REDD Plus was effectively posited as the solution for addressing this paradox. By this, I mean that countries like Guyana and Suriname were desirous of attaining development, but they were also navigating some of the pressures that come with trying to respond to climate change. So the threat of flooding and just all the other negative effects. So in order to try to gain the resources to address climate change, they would need to access certain forms of development, which in an environment where the majority of the land is forested, this development impetus is likely to have some type of effect, most likely negative, on the forest cover. So the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation Initiative was posited as part of the solution. In other words, countries like Guyana and Suriname that had significant amounts of forest cover, and not only countries, as the initiative evolved over time, but basically forest owners and users would be paid not to cut the forest down. So initially, these forest users and owners were imagining that Red Plus would be able to displace economically, would be able to displace environmentally harmful activity by just seeing them gain the income that they otherwise would have gotten if they cut the forest down. So I wanted to see if this could work. And I did it basically by traveling to different parts of Guyana and Suriname. So just to quickly say, in the case of Guyana, I went to Madia, the area encircled in black. That's a mining hotspot in Guyana, or was at the time. And then to a group of indigenous communities further south, that's encircled in orange in the map. I chose these communities based on their accessibility, classification, and the nearby forest threats. Spent a bit of time in each one. And in Suriname, I spent a significant amount of time in the Brokopondo region. You can see the circle on the right. This is where the Afobaka Dam is, and I mentioned the Suriname River that continues on. This was the area where I spoke to the Maroons and so on, with whom I started this talk. And a little further left, I went to Apura, and this was where the indigenous woman who I spoke to, coming to the end of the series of pictures, this is where she was situated. I was trying to understand how communities interpreted Red Plus, how they were experiencing threats to the forests, and to gain just a better understanding of how the initiative was playing out on the ground. So all in all, I assert that if you want to understand forest governance and conservation, you need to understand its threats. If you want to uproot or address those threats, you need to understand their origins. So this quest to understand how and why people use the forest in certain ways drove me to try to understand how colonialism structures and informs ongoing forest use and governance efforts, and to imagine ways of addressing and dismantling these structures. Just to briefly outline what I mean by colonialism. So drawing on the definition by Tuck and Yang, colonialism can be understood as a set of practices hinged on the forced control of space and the domination of lands, bodies, and nature by an other who becomes localized. The colonizing other either extracts those resources from the dominated country and relocates them to the colonial metropole for its use, or it internally appropriates space and resources in the dominated country for their own good. So basically, the distinction that Tuck and Yang are making in this definition of colonialism is basically between more extractive forms of colonization, such as the ones in Guyana and Suriname, where the resource use, the claim for resources, is more the driver of the colonizing impetus, versus more settler colonies like the United States. So the Caribbean region, as I sought to highlight, is shaped almost entirely through colonial histories, having experienced some of the longest periods of colonization. And these histories remain evident in state formation, social and racial composition, and economic circumstances. It also, therefore, informs the region's vulnerability to climate change in terms of the availability of economic resources, knowledge systems, and so on which these countries could potentially or not draw in order to try to respond to the challenge. And the Caribbean, especially Guyana, Suriname, and Belize, the region is also still in possession of some highly valuable conservation areas, such as the Amazon rainforest. But I didn't do research in Belize. I was only able to focus, unfortunately, on Guyana and Suriname, although I think this was still quite good. So coloniality, or at least the observation that coloniality is a useful way of understanding the continuities between the colonial, also shapes my work. So Anibal Quijano's colonial matrix of power embodies a crucial starting point for my work and thinking. His thesis views the persistent impact of colonialism on contemporary society as a matrix of intersecting power structures that perpetuates colonial patterns of producing benefits for certain actors in the West while disenfranchising others. Similarly, his coloniality of being shows how racially defined hierarchies established during colonialism continue to shape and inform global distributions of power. These distributions are evident in how certain groups of mainly white Western people remain still locked largely into the role as beneficent of capital accumulation, while large groups of mainly African origin and indigenous others are designated as dispensable. Quijano's thesis is that structures cemented through the colonial enterprise bolster the distribution of power today and continue to be reflected in the ongoing global condition in which Western European countries benefit disproportionately from activities that continue to support capital accumulation in former centers. Coloniality, the distribution of power emerging from these colonial dynamics, understood in this way, is foundational to the distribution of world power. In other words, even parts of the world that were not colonized by Europeans continue to have to grapple with the power structures that are informed by this colonial experience. As Mignolo and Walsh describe, this perspective is embryonic of the modernity-coloniality relationship, through which these two conditions are two sides of the same coin. Neoliberalism then emerged as an embodiment of this intensified relationship and is deeply interwoven with and allied to conserving nature through neoliberal policymaking. Viewed through this lens, neoliberal conservation, such as Red Plus, of which Red Plus is a good example, is known to be a new form of marrying conventionally damaging market activities with the goal of environmental conservation. And it can be seen, therefore, as a symptom of ongoing coloniality. Hence, it becomes clear that the rise of capitalism, fueled by the colonization of the Americas and elsewhere, and capitalism's subsequent intensification through neoliberalism from the 1970s onwards, did not only have impacts on labor, race, and knowledge, but on the environment and efforts to conserve it. Need to make my slides work, don't know why they're not moving. Aha. So why decolonize? I think that this is the pivotal question. Provided that a satisfactory answer can be put forward, the inquisitive mind quickly wonders, but how could one even attempt such a thing? So in the book, I try to put forward an answer. And this argument hinges first and foremost on the recognition that histories of colonization function as a structural condition that must be recognized and dismantled through decolonization if forest governance is to successfully counter the world's most urgent environmental challenges. So in the interest, before I continue on, let me highlight Fanon's definition of decolonization that you see on your screen. It reads, decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. Decolonization, as we know, is a historical process. That is to say that it cannot be understood, it cannot become intelligible, nor clear to itself, except in the exact measure that we can discern the movements which give it historical form and content. So in the interest of limiting the progress of one such global environmental challenge, that of human-induced climate change, the Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation initiative rose to become the biggest, most ambitious plan to arrest deforestation of tropical forests around the world. It proceeded from the premise that tropical forests sequester large amounts of carbon from the atmosphere as they grow. Carbon dioxide, one of the harmful gases driving climate change, is then kept trapped in the mass of the forests. As forests and surrounding vegetation decay and degrade, carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. Hence, in the interest of keeping sequestered carbon dioxide locked away in the forests, REDD Plus aims to provide financial incentives to forest managers, users, and owners to dissuade them from engaging in deforesting activities. Put simply, it aims to stack the decision-making process on how to use forests against decisions that result in deforestation. Since tropical forests hold more carbon than temperate or boreal ones, REDD Plus is being rolled out in tropical states that still have significant tropical forest cover. However, this group of developing or not yet industrialized states, through little coincidence, tends to be those strongly defined by their colonial pasts. Consequently, the increasingly urgent need to address climate change by reducing carbon dioxide emissions brought with it growing demand for the services provided by the forests of Guyana and Suriname in situ through these states' participation in the initiative. Promoted as being able to make forests worth more alive than dead, REDD Plus was championed by its proponents, both within and outside of Guyana and Suriname, as a tool for conserving the world's tropical forests. Much like other market-based conservation mechanisms around the world, it was framed as a win-win solution that would allow both countries to develop economically while conserving their forests for the greater global environmental good. REDD Plus, as initially taken up by Guyana's government, one of its earliest proponents, was depicted as a market instrument imbued with a certain neutrality that allows it to sidestep political and social considerations around forest use practices and to bring about reductions in deforestation. In the international arena, it was promoted as a shortcut of sorts for achieving what was described as the low-hanging fruit of the climate mitigation game. So in the book, I try to show how the eventual implementation of REDD Plus in Guyana and Suriname made visible the structuring tendencies of the continued colonial present, thus demonstrating the need to decolonize forest governance. Decolonizing forest governance depends, first and foremost, on acknowledging how REDD Plus is positioned within the histories and present-day social, economic, and political conditions of the jurisdictions within which it is implemented. Since these two countries are the only two REDD Plus states within the Guiana Shield, their simultaneous exploration allowed me to reflect on processes of state formation and forest demarcation as significant relics of colonialism, with material consequences on modern day forest governance and conservation. The book's exploration of the experiences of Guyana and Suriname as independent forested states in the Guiana Shield formed almost entirely through their not so distant colonial pasts as they negotiate increasingly present-day demands for their natural resources and its services, provides useful fodder for imagining and charting a path towards fairer, less Eurocentric, more diversely agential decolonial futures. The Amazon forests, stretching across Guyana, Suriname, and the wider Guyana Shield, witnessed the entirety of the colonial and post-colonial encounter, experiences that are central to the formation of maroon communities. Over centuries, the forests of the Guiana Shield provided a place of refuge to people who fled the coasts to form the spatial outskirts of colonial centers in northern South America. During this time, the forests were themselves partitioned, regrouped, uprooted, and used as shelter from the whirlwind of capital generating activity on the coast of the Shield. In the era of climate change, I note, the significance of these forests came to be even further enhanced as the international community began to recognize their sustainable management and conservation as crucial to global ecological and human well-being, with effects far beyond the boundaries of the shield itself. I don't know how I'm doing on time. If anybody's listening, could I have a sense of how much time I have left?
It's 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll do my best. Thank you, Dina.
Okay. I
So
mean,
Guyana,
you have
mhm,
10 minutes maximum. So if you need to go a bit more higher, this is fine.
okay, thank you. So Guyana's independence from the British was influenced by external powers from its very outset. While Suriname's independence saw the Netherlands emerge as, sorry, Suriname's independence from the Netherlands saw instead the emergence of a paternalist relationship with the former colonial master and marginal engagement with the international community. In the decades that followed, the independent governments that came to govern Guyana and Suriname, along with international development organizations, began to recast the forests historically as a place of refuge. I'm sorry, need to say that again. These organizations, independent governments, and so on, along with international development organizations, they began to recast the forests, which were historically a place of refuge from coastal capital accumulating activities, as natural resources to be exploited to fuel development and modernization goals. Maroon communities persisted throughout historical shifts from colonialism to independence, after having been after having been established on decidedly anti-colonial grounds. To them, the forest stood as the antithesis of capital-generating activities centered on the coasts. It was this pursuit of capital that had enslaved people, subordinated nature, created colonies, and consolidated all colonized land into independent states, including land claimed by indigenous and Maroon communities. The anti-colonial gestures of Maroon communities have since been present in Guyana and Suriname, although subsumed within modernity's onward march. I have to skip past all my theory to basically say that I opted to use Foucauldian governmentality as a lens for representing the different colonial strategies of governing the forest and its use throughout roughly 5 centuries of colonial histories in these two places. And what the book does is to try to recognize these different colonial governing strategies and to think of how they could be decolonized. Hence, what you see is the first chapter being called Behead the Sovereign, which basically recognizes the fact that the colonial claim on the land that became Guyana and Suriname continues to be manifested in the independent governance of these two countries. You see this when indigenous communities assert their rights to the land and are confronted with the requirement for them to have clear tenure over their lands that is legitimized by the state governments. So if we wanted to decolonize forest governance in this part of the world, it depends on, as already highlighted, recognizing the fact that the colonial land claim remains, it coheres and continues to support the independent land claim that continues to marginalize the people who live in the forests. I also suggested that we need to decenter markets. So markets have their roots in this exploitative environmental colonial relationship, especially in this part of the world. So if we want to think about other ways of being and relating to nature, markets and financial values cannot be the primary language. It's also important that we undiscipline subjects. And when I say this, I do not mean just an external we that could go in a similar colonial maneuver to undiscipline anyone else, but it recognizes that the people who populate this part of the world relate to nature in similar exploitative ways as did the colonizers, because different ways of internalizing this relationship to nature have persisted in a way that that continues to see maroon and indigenous ways of being as other. So it requires a somewhat tense recognition of how discipline is somewhat positive in trying to limit deforestation from gold mining, but the ways in which a particular view towards modernity and a desire to live like Europeans or Western people continues to inform this desire. And finally, I talk about countering discipline with truths. And by this, I mean trying to re-engage with the different ways of relating to nature that came with the variety of people who now make up the region and who now populate these countries in a way that is no longer suppressed by a particular Eurocentric view of how life should be pursued. So I argue that pursuing decolonization in states shaped almost entirely by the colonial encounter depends on a combination of things. First, decolonization requires, just to repeat briefly, less deference to the sovereign state in questions of forest governance. Second, it necessitates the removal of the market from its increasingly central position as arbiter of environmental and social affairs. Third, it involves the undisciplining of the racialized subjects of colonial governance. And finally, it demands that those ethics and ways of being in the world that are associated with pre-colonial and non-Eurocentric traditions, knowledge traditions, be amplified. In developing these arguments, I examine how recent global efforts to govern and conserve forests are being stymied by colonial histories, especially in those forests that have been shaped over time as places of refuge, and imagine the colonial futures in Guyana, Suriname, and beyond. In wrapping up, I'll say that all in all, I see decolonization as holding modernity's Eurocentrism to account while making visible those ways of being that were marginalized by colonialism for centuries. Decolonization does not default to a romanticization of the past, but it advocates for dismantling the colonially structured present. It requires the dismantling of colonial structures in a way that examines processes and histories of racialization manifested in the very existence of the Guyanese and Surinamese states, since it was through colonization, slavery, and indentureship, operating to varying degrees in service of capitalism, that these states took shape. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Ariane. It was really and well in time. Fantastic. I mean, I did. That's why I didn't come before because you are going so well on time. Thanks everyone. Now, you can the Q&A is open. Everyone can ask the question. Just raise your hands, or you can put in the chat, and I'll come to you for the question. Um, we can start with Les, and then by the time others will come and join. Les.
Okay, thanks. That's great. Has some overlaps with my research in South America. I want to ask more about decolonization because it always depends on some strategy for both resistance and alternatives, which can be complementary. And these probably exist to some extent in many parts of the world, including Guyana, but aren't obvious unless someone has the nous and determination to understand them from the inside. So how do you see the relationship between resistance and alternatives?
Interesting question. Thanks for that. I'd say the resistance and alternatives. I think what's important and what I try to do in the book is to highlight the fact that there is resistance that has always been there and always been present. What happened over time is that this resistance has been almost also figuratively submerged by the colonial structure. The need to actually imagine alternatives is a really difficult idea to wrap my mind around, because even though I set out what should happen ideally in the book, as in we should decenter markets and so on, who exactly should do this is the question. I like to think of it as an eventual decolonizing impetus that will take shape should eventually enough people recognize the need and importance for thinking outside of the colonial box. So I can't say that one single strategy or one single actor could bring us towards decolonization. That would actually be perhaps against the decolonial ethic. But I would hope that eventually enough people will recognize that um, the overrepresentation of Europe is not necessarily beneficial for addressing environmental concerns and changing the trajectory that we're on. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks for
Yes,
that.
yes, briefly, to allow time for other questions. Thanks. Thank you well.
I will wait. Ari?
Oh, yeah. Sorry, can you hear me? Yeah.
Hi, Arabella.
Hello, and thank you for such a rich presentation. So much food for thought, and I said there's so much more you could have said, so feel free to amplify. There's so much rich detail, isn't there? And the Caribbean is such a fascinating region as well because of those differences in statehood and the histories of statehood. And I wonder if there was more to say about the differences between Guyana and Suriname in terms of those kind of metropole colonial, post-colonial state relationships and how they're negotiated through these kind of initiatives, and yeah, highlighting those differences might also kind of elucidate different strategies of decolonializing in different political contexts. And I had a second question, which was more for us, I guess, also as a group of researchers and what this implies for methods. And I've had a fascinating morning. I've spent an hour with a Mexican PhD student who's tried to decolonize her methodologies, and her methodology chapter is quite simply beyond methods, that this kind of standard social science toolkit we have and we deploy actually can really inhibit kind of opening alternative ways of being and thinking. And I wonder what your reflections on that might be and how we think about our own practice as a group of kind of scholars and researchers. And finally, oil. And obviously you were involved in our films. We've made a series of films for our new second year module, introducing global development, in which you feature. Thank you so much. Talking about Guyana, and obviously the first is about oil development in Guyana and Aberdeen, and massive market shift, massive shift of state mentality, of all sorts of economies and cultures. And what does this mean, I guess, for the way that initiatives like RED might be reconceptualized, or how difficult is it now for a state like Guyana to actually confront the tensions between an oil producing nation and a reforesting nation? It's almost incompatible. But thank you so much.
Thank you for the questions. I feel like I could write another book in response to them. Thanks so much. So I'll start at the end. Oil. It depends on trying to grapple with Guyana's move towards becoming an oil producer depends almost on which point you entered your engagements with Guyana's environmental policy making. I remember when Red Plus became a thing. The president at the time, Jardeo, he was talking, he received a number of awards on the international community and so on. A lot of people saw him as a leader in trying to think about green manifestations or interpretations of development, so other ways of, so alternatives perhaps. But he was also heavily critiqued for perhaps just doing it for the money. So it was just recognizing that Guyana had a significant amount of forests and therefore could try to harness these forests to try to gain earn just income from the international community. So to the extent that you agree that REDD Plus was never meaningfully about displacing the drivers of deforestation, it was just about money, it aligns quite well with the fact that oil is taking off in the region because now it's just another large income source that potentially displaces REDD Plus, as in there's less of a need for REDD Plus now that the country will gain all this money from oil production and export. I'm not sure if I should say where I stand, but I'm basically I'm paying attention to the developments in that Guyana recently signed another agreement that's REDD Plus-esque with a private entity that's now claiming credits from the forest and so on. And my most optimistic take on the oil situation, the most optimistic take that I could come up with is that as the country grows much richer financially, there is going to be more pressure on the forest because the coasts are crowded. And people are going to try to expand their economic earning potentials into the forested areas. If by any means these carbon offsetting initiatives that the government now seems to be putting the forest up for, if by any means this dissuades the expansion into the forested areas, then maybe there is some glimmer of like a positive sign. But largely, I think it has always been about the finances, the financial earning potential. Therefore, the shift towards oil doesn't quite surprise me. Just to say a little bit more about that, I did research in Guyana in 2022. So after oil had been announced and the country had already started to establish itself as a producer or exporter, and what I was being told is that the quality by policymakers, the quality of the oil is less environmentally harmful, which means that if we were to think about a climate just transition away from oil, a socially just transition away from oil, then Guyana is in a good place because the more harmful oil producers should perhaps go first. Just telling you what I was told. So decolonizing methods. This is something that keeps coming up, but it's not it's a topic that I could speak to much other than reading about it intellectually, largely because I carried out my research using ethnographic methods that saw me in dialoguing with some of the traditional international organizations. I did internships with the UNDP and so on. So I didn't use decolonial methods. It was at the end of my project when I realized that I was making an argument that colonialism continued to structure things, that I started to analytically engage with the decolonizing impetus and to try to see how decolonization could be imagined. So I didn't use the colonial methods, but I definitely see their value and look forward to reading research that deploys these methods in new ways. The differences, and the first question, differences between Guyana and Suriname. There are lots. But generally naturally there are lots, but I approach these two countries as one case study. It's not a comparative study. I actually think that their independence from two different countries, two different colonial powers, their different approaches to navigating the demands for development of their people and the environment and so on, they help to bring the colonial experience into combined view rather than just, what's the word I'm looking for? Then kind of enclosing this. It helps to make the colonial experience more visible and structuring, as in the manifestation of these two countries, rather than saying, let's just look at how colonialism informs one particular place. I'm not saying this will, but you see these colonial history showing up in very many different ways. So for example, in Suriname, the communities have almost no land rights, none. So as I mentioned, in the 17th and 18th centuries, there were the peace agreements that were signed. So the communities had some sort of independence that was very different than in Guyana. But since independence, these land rights have been basically obliterated. And the government only recognizes individual land claims and not collective ones. So that means that land rights in Suriname, they're really fraught. The indigenous community there had taken the government to court and so on to try to get to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights to try to force the government to act. The judgment was in their favor, the community's favor, but still little was done to change things. In the case of Guyana, there are land rights. Some communities benefit from land rights. They don't go far enough in that the state still, for example, claims a right to the subsoil, therefore to mining. You have communities communities situated alongside mines, for example, and having to deal with all the negative effects of people from the coast coming to mine in their communities and all the negative social impacts that come from that in this transient engagement and so on. So there are quite a few differences. Just the very existence of maroon communities in Suriname and none in Guyana also helps to highlight some of these differences. I could keep going, but I think we're running out of time.
No, thanks, Ariane. If you want to elaborate a little bit more, we have time for that. That's fine, absolutely. Let me check if there is another question from the audience. Um, yeah, I mean, I'll just ask one question till is about Red Plus. I mean, I don't have a background in it, and so I just wanted, and silly fishing note. What can you give us a bit more elaborate on what is Red Plus, how significant it is, who were involved in developing it, and just a little bit of just to help, because it seems to be the key part of your book as well as the case studies, and you're looking at it, so it will be good to get a bit of more idea about that.
Okay, so I'll tell you alongside like my personal narrative in case anybody can't recognize my accent. I'm Guyanese. So when I finished my degree, I was watching during my undergrad. I actually wrote a dissertation that said that the only way that countries like Guyana and Suriname would keep their forest standing is by being paid not to cut it down. And a few years later, I was watching TV, and the government channel said basically that they were pursuing this initiative, and it was being called RED. Not that they read my undergraduate dissertation, but clearly people saw that it thought that this avoided deforestation idea would be good. So the government of Guyana worked with other countries that had significant forest covers, so the Coalition of Rainforest Nations, to come up with this idea that countries that had standing forests should be compensated for not cutting it down. And this took place within a framework where the Clean Development Mechanism at the time was committing industrialized countries to reduce their emissions, but not non-industrialized countries. And that meant that industrialized countries were starting to offset their emissions in the global south in non-industrialized countries. But at the time, only afforestation initiatives, so tree planting and so on, only those things were made legible in this framework. So countries that had high forest cover were feeling left out and wanting to be compensated for keeping it standing. So this was in around 2010 that this idea was floated, and the Coalition for Rainforest Nations lobbied to try to get international acceptance of this idea. In 2015, it was actually recognized as a policy option within the UN SCCC, so within the climate change framework. So the question became how to implement this. And at first, the idea was that there would be a cap on global carbon emissions, so a limit, 1.5 degrees, let's say, and that would limit the amount of emissions that could take place. And that trading carbon this way within that limit would help to make offsetting more efficient. So where was I going with this? So Red Plus emerged in this environment, and in anticipation of the actual carbon market being developed, a number of states and organizations stepped in to give pilot funding to help to get countries ready for the eventual carbon market. So we saw from like 2007 onwards a lot of the debates around avoiding deforestation and trying to conserve forests being oriented around REDD+. REDD+ being now what I say is one of the biggest, most accepted payments for ecosystem service initiatives globally. So a whole lot of it, so it's really important because avoiding deforestation is key to the maintenance of the Amazon, which is key to keeping the planet within any kind of tolerable threshold. So REDD+ is therefore pretty important in this architecture. But just to say, the United Nations set up its own offshoot. So there's the United Nations REDD+ initiative that try to channel funding towards readiness for REDD. Recognizing that a number of tropical countries didn't have the capacity to engage in REDD+ monitoring, reporting, and verification efforts. And the World Bank also has the Forest Carbon Partnership Facility that does the same thing. And then Norway, who shall not go unmentioned, was a really big contributor to generating funding for REDD+. So it's this international effort to try to get countries ready for this carbon market that would ideally eventually reduce deforestation globally.
Thanks for that explanation. I will just see if we have any more questions from the audience. I think if people are getting ready for the Easter break on our side of the story. So,
Can't blame them.
okay. Again, if not, I'll really like to thank Ariadne for this wonderful, fascinating, and really interesting presentation. It will be online. It will be available for people to see. And everyone, really thanks for joining the seminar. The next one is on 22nd of May. It will be given by Dr. Laurie Parson on carbon colonialism, how rich countries export climate breakdown is going to be the focus of discussion. Everyone have a good break, Easter break. Ariadne, again, thanks for everyone and see you all. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.